Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, "I seek God! I seek God!" As many of those who do not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. "Why, did he get lost?" said one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" said another. "Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated?" Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his glances. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not yet feel the breath of empty space? Has it not yet become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? What was holiest and most powerful of all that the earth has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe away this blood from us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must not we ourselves become gods simply to seem worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever will be born after us for the sake of this deed, he will be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him with astonishment. At last, he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke and went out. "I have come too early," he said to them. "My time has not yet come. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of man. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds require time, even after they have been done, before they can be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves." It has been related further that on that same day the madman entered divers churches and there sang his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Let out and called to account, he is said to have replied each time, "What are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" Okay, so welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video is going to be the 5th video where we'll be examining the work of the late 19th century philosopher and philologist Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's probably obvious from that quote, which is a very famous quote from a book called The Gay Science, which is included in your portable Nietzsche book on pages 95 and 96. It's a very famous quote which is about a theme that appears in numerous places within Nietzsche's work. For instance, it appears rather early in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the theme is going to be, for today, the death of God. And maybe I should warn you, this video might be a little bit shorter than average, and the reason why is because I want to do the part that comes after this about the eternal recurrence all in one video. So I'm just going to make a relatively short video about the death of God, as Nietzsche talks about it. Okay, so obviously this idea is meant as a kind of provocation, especially with respect to the prevailing Christian morality and Christian values of the late 19th century, and probably a provocation for us too, insofar as we, according to Nietzsche's analysis, are still living out primarily a Christian and slave morality relation to life. Okay, so the question is going to be how to interpret this other than as a mere act of provocation, which, by the way, would be in the service of overcoming our typical posture that we take for granted and so on. So maybe first it's good to mention that it's, integrally knit into this whole project of overcoming values and hermeneutics of suspicion and all of that kind of stuff. Now, here's the normal take on the death of God. The normal take on it is that, well, this is where Nietzsche is owning his essentially atheistic position. Okay, so atheism is, of course, the position that God does not exist. All right, so it's a position that denies the existence of God. Oh, I forgot. I was going to do a hat of the day. Do I have a hat of the day? No, I do not have a hat of the day. All right, so let's continue on. Sorry about that. In the next video, I'll do the hat of the day to try to keep my hair under control. All right, so back to the death of God rather than the death of bad hair. Okay, so this is supposedly an indicator of Nietzsche's essentially atheistic position, but I'm going to invite you in the next minute to suspect whether that's really true or not, because certainly the idea that God has died is not the same as a typical vanilla atheistic position, because a typical vanilla atheistic position would be that, well, God never existed in the first place. All right, so the idea that God has died somehow is already a deviation from vanilla atheism or straightforward atheism. Okay, so you can already begin to suspect whether this is really what it's touted as being, which is an expression of atheism. Second reason that you might start to doubt it, that yes, Nietzsche does call into question the prevailing Christian ethos and the place of God in our lives and so on, that this too, from his point of view, is something to be overcome and not just to be taken for granted or taken as a place for us to rest easily and complacently with respect to our lives and our relation to the world and so on. But Nietzsche, now the other side of the coin, Nietzsche also identifies himself very often with Dionysus. Okay, so Dionysus, of course, is, as we saw in the previous video, the classical Greek god of intoxication, creative fertility, celebration, and that sort of thing. Well, it seems rather odd for someone who's supposedly an atheist to be rejecting the Christian theistic conception of God only to defer to another conception of a God at any rate, because you would expect that a real diehard atheist wouldn't defer to any God at all, okay? But that would repudiate all gods or all conception of gods and not just merely repudiate one in order to defer to another. So that's the second thing that you might wonder about with respect to whether Nietzsche's position is supposedly atheistic. So it's problematic, more or less, to say that, well, this assertion that God is dead is tantamount to a thoroughgoing atheism. Well, that's it doesn't seem that that's obviously true. Okay, so then the question is, well, then, if it's not an expression of straightforward atheism, then how are we going to make sense of this God is dead idea? And here's the sort of typical way of rendering it, that it's not actually an assertion that's theological in nature. In other words, it's not actually an assertion about the existence or non-existence of God. What he's really trying to get at is something on the order of a historical and sociological type observation rather than a theological pronouncement. Okay, so, well, what would that be? What would the historical, sociological type assertion be? Well, it goes kind of like this, and maybe you'll have to recall a little bit of history to ride along with this, because if you've ever read works from let's say, even the Enlightenment period or the early Enlightenment period, you can be impressed with how often thinkers and philosophers of the early, even the early Enlightenment period, so often have to include God in all of their works. For instance, in Descartes' first Meditations, you think of Descartes as a Enlightenment thinker. He was born in 1596. He died in 1650. Okay, so that's right smack in the Enlightenment period. Well, in his first Meditations, Descartes saw fit to include God in his, in the very middle part of sort of the pivotal part in his first Meditations, which of course is probably one of the most famous works in the entire Western canon of philosophy. So at any rate, that's just a marker of how often these thinkers, certainly in the Middle Ages, my goodness, if you go back further into the Middle Ages or even the Renaissance period, man, God is just everywhere. Like God is, you can't say anything without including God. And I'm suggesting that that even continued into the Enlightenment period, or at least the first half of the Enlightenment period. And it's a marker of the centrality of God, and more specifically, the Christian conception of God in Western affairs concerning everything. Everything is about God. Or think about the papacy during the medieval centuries, and even the Renaissance period, and even the Enlightenment period, where the papacy, my goodness, the papacy was pretty much all powerful in Europe for many centuries. Like if you ran afoul of the clerics, God help you. Like Galileo was running afoul of the clerics of the time when he was asking them to look through his primitive telescope to observe that moons were orbiting Jupiter, all right, the planet Jupiter. So he had this early telescope and he was looking through it, and he trained his telescope on Jupiter, which is the biggest planet in our solar system, and he noticed, I think it was 4 moons there actually. Of course, and nowadays we know that there are at least 12 that I can think of. But with his primitive telescope, he could see at least a few moons of Jupiter orbiting Jupiter. And he asked the clerics of the church to take a look at this. And of course, they were having none of it. And the reason why is because according to Christian orthodoxy of the time, everything had to revolve around the earth, okay? Because man was the center of the earth, all right? So, or man, humankind was the center of the earth, right? So Galileo's looking through the telescope was seen as a deeply heretical act, and one that would be, if he didn't recant, good luck, Galileo, because probably your fate is going to be tortured to death. All right, so as an expression of God's love, perhaps you'll be tortured to death. All right, so why am I bringing all that up? Because, like, there was a time, and it was a long period of time within European history, when God was it. God was the center of everything, for sure. Now, compare that to the conditions, not merely in the 19th century when Nietzsche was writing, but I think it's even more vivid if you look at the conditions today in the early 21st century. Well, yeah, there's still churches and there's still believers, for sure. But the thing is that for most people, the vast majority of people, God occupies a relatively narrow sector of their lives, like their prayer life and their contact with Scripture and their reading of Scripture and their attempts to interpret Scripture and going to church is not the center of life, the universe, and anything anymore, even for most believers. Instead, it's sort of a fractional part of their lives, and there are many parts of life that are much larger than that fraction. For instance, our work lives, for most of us, our work lives are not particularly God-centered, occupy a way larger fraction of our lives than, let's say, our prayer life and our reading of Scripture combined. Okay, so in fact, I would say for most people, and even most believers, their contact with the internet is probably fractionally many times greater than the amount of time they spend praying and reading Scripture. Well, something has changed throughout the course of history, that God would no longer occupy, in a way, the center of our lives, but would just be a kind of fractional element of our lives. Something has definitely shifted between, let's pin it on the medieval period, because that's probably the most obvious period, between the medieval period and now. All right? And that's really what Nietzsche's getting at with this God is dead idea. And the paradox of that is that, well, if God really is the way that Christian theism has it, you know, the omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent creator of life, the universe, and everything, the Alpha and the Omega, you would expect God to be the center of human affairs because he created it all. All right? So it's kind of a strange turning of history that somehow God, as the omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent creator of everything, would occupy only a relatively minor, fractional part of our lives. So it's in that sense that God is dead. God as the necessary center of all things human, that has died away. That has died away. That God could move from being, in a sense, omnipresent within our culture to being a relatively minor fraction of our cultural affairs and human affairs, that means something has changed. Something is like God as the center, as the be-all, end-all of life, the universe, and everything. That God is dead for us in terms of historical process. All right, so why is this important? Well, part of why it's important has to do with the vacuum that God has left. All right, so the thing about the medieval period, I'm just going to localize it there because that's the easiest reference point, is that, you know, when God is sort of everywhere and included in everything and is the central and obvious organizing point for all of society and all of culture, well, the payoff is that it provides like an instant meaning and orientation and direction for our lives and our energies and our thinking and so on and so forth. Like, we don't have to think too hard about what our lives mean in a time and place like that, because it's all defined for us, right? And if you have any questions about it, well, ask your local bishop, all right, or someone like that. Today, we don't have that, right? So God, as the central organizing principle not only of society but of our individual lives too, leaves us, that God has died in that sense, leaves us in a state of existential vacuum. And here I'm using Viktor Frankl's apt phrase. Okay, so we're in a state of existential vacuum where we don't have an immediate orientation to life that's obvious and that all it is a matter of deferring to it as best you can and all of that. Like, we have to, in the 21st century, especially, we have to sort of, cut and paste. Okay, let's use a computer metaphor. Cut and paste our lives together, out of different sort of involvements and meanings and different things people say. And really, you don't know what the truth is because it's not meted out for us easily by way of the Bible. And even if you read the Bible, which is, I think I still read the Bible, but an interesting, powerful book and interesting in any number of ways. But it's like, well, there are many other books for you to read, and many other ideas and many other, part of, because we live in a global world state now, well, you can easily be exposed to many other religious traditions. You can get into shamanism or paganism or Hinduism or Shintoism or Jainism or, it doesn't necessarily, like Christianity isn't the only, the only show in town or something like that. I'm looking for some phrase, the only show in town. I don't know. Okay, so it's not the only game that you can play. There are many different games you can play in our global world state, but the difficulty is that which one we should play is not obvious. You got to figure it out for yourself, right? And that's a state of existential vacuum where the meaning of our lives and the direction for our energies is not particularly obvious. All right, so we're left in this weird state to invent our lives. So I'll read from your notes for a second here. With existential vacuum comes an inevitable amount of anxiety, as we try to invent our lives, along with our attempts to reassert the old comforting paradigm, which is one way of viewing today's retro-fundamentalism. But at the same time, so the positive side of existential vacuum is there is emerging an exhilarating new freedom and a new trackless expanse on which to create forms of life previously unimaginable. Okay, so that's sort of the upshot of existential vacuum. The negative part is that, yeah, it's a more anxious state to be in when you have to sort of cobble together the meaning of your existence, and you can't just defer to a ready-made answer as to what human existence is all about. And by the way, everything revolves around the earth, because that's where humanity is. All right, so like, yeah, that's gone. That's gone. I mean, even cosmologically, we know that, the earth is just one relatively minor planet orbiting around a relatively minor star, which in turn is orbiting around the center of our Milky Way galaxy, and at the center of our Milky Way galaxy is something like a supermassive black hole, which is, an almost unimaginably dense and massive mass of matter. And that in turn the Milky Way galaxy is just one of many billions of galaxies moving through the larger firmament. And it's like, well damn, it's such a disappointment to discover that we occupy such a trivial place within the larger order of things, which is probably the real reason why Galileo had to recant all the business about seeing the moons of Jupiter under threat of being tortured to death, in essence. So that's the meaning of God is dead. So God is dead in the sense that he no longer occupies the central organizing position within human affairs, or perhaps more specifically, Western cultural affairs. So God in that sense is what has died off. So that's the usual rendering of God is dead. Now, I'd like to end this video about God is dead with a joke, because in the previous video we were talking about jokes and laughter, and Nietzsche is kind of a joker, a little bit of a joker, although he can be very ponderous at points too. But this is a joke that was it's a graffiti joke that actually the great translator of Nietzsche comments on in a footnote I think it's in the Gay Science, as I recall, and to get this joke, you have to imagine being in a bathroom where graffiti is being written. Now most of our graffiti, I think, is written on the internet. I've noticed over time that there's a lot less bathroom graffiti being written, and I think the reason why is because everyone's sort of getting out that impulse on the internet of anonymously sort of putting their provocative ideas and trolling out there on the internet. So there's not that much need to to write on bathroom walls. And anyhow, people are probably a lot less likely to carry pens and pencils around nowadays, now that everything is digitized. But at any rate, this is an old bathroom graffiti joke. So I'm going to put the bathroom graffiti joke up here to my left, to your right, on the wall. So the first line is, God is dead, Nietzsche. Okay. Now, the second line of the joke is to reverse that a little bit. Nietzsche is dead, God. Okay. Now, there's a possible third line of the joke, but it depends upon someone having misspelled Nietzsche, which is actually a very easy name to misspell. In fact, probably most of the time in graffiti, people do misspell it. So if someone misspelled Nietzsche somewhere, the possible third line of the joke is, you misspelled Nietzsche, Kaufman. Okay, and here maybe you have to know that, of course, Kaufman is the great translator of Nietzsche's works and commentator on Nietzsche's works. In fact, Walter Kaufmann right here. Okay, so you misspelled Nietzsche, Kaufman. Okay, and maybe you don't think that's a great joke, but like I said in the previous video, it takes a certain kind of sense of humor to get these jokes as they appear within the corpus of Nietzsche's writings and also within the much larger corpus of people's commentary about Nietzsche. But at any rate, so God is dead. God remains dead. Have a nice day.